This is our second video segment on the topic of critical thinking. And just to review what happened in the first segment, we've been talking about these four components of critical thinking instruction. And so far, we've talked about in class dispositions or attitudes, or the kind of personal orientations that students need in order to think critically, the specific critical thinking skills that we should be teaching students. And so, what we're going to be talking, and how those skills, I should say, are domain specific. So, how you would think about, or I should say, how claims and evidence and how we evaluate those claims are domain specific, and how you should apply critical thinking skills, so deductive reasoning, inductive reasoning, in domain specific ways. So, if I'm thinking about deductive reasoning and the relationship between evidence and whether it supports a claim, I should be evaluating that evidence in a domain specific way. And so what we're going to do in this segment of video is talk a little bit about the other two components of critical thinking instruction, so training activities to facilitate transfer and metacognition. And then we're going to use these four components of critical thinking instruction to think about implications for the classroom and talk a little bit about those, although we'll talk about these implications some more when we're meet together on Tuesday. So let's first talk about what we mean by facilitating transfer. So as we've talked about, when we say transfer, we mean the application of skills to new contexts. And just connecting back to what we talked about earlier, when we're talking about skills, we're talking about developing procedural knowledge. And step two is really developing those skills, teaching students explicitly how to evaluate hypotheses, how to think about correlation and causation, how to think about claims and evidence, how to think about the representativeness of a sample. So we're actually teaching concrete skills. But as we talked about a few times in class, transfer is not automatic for students. Students don't automatically apply their skills to new contexts. And so when we're talking about facilitating transfer, we're not just talking about procedural knowledge in terms of how to do the skill. We're also talking about conditional knowledge in terms of when to perform the skill, or how to always engage the critical thinking skills, how to make it something that students do routinely. So whenever students come across something in their textbook or something in the newspaper or something on TV where people are presenting correlational evidence as causal, students say, oh, wait a minute, I don't think that's correct. So how we make them do that all the time. And so the third part of instruction is how to facilitate transfer, how to facilitate the application of critical thinking. I'll use CT for critical thinking skills to new contexts. And when we talk about implications for instruction, we'll talk about how to teach that transfer, how to help students apply those skills. And the fourth component of critical thinking instruction is metacognition. And metacognition is a term that we've used a few times in this class. And so I'll ask you to pause here and think about what do we mean when we say metacognition? Try to decompose the word. So what does meta mean? What does cognition mean? And see if you can develop your own definition. And so if you've done that, I can tell you that metacognition is defined as thinking about your thinking. And if that sounds super weird and complicated to you, let me give you an example. So when I am reading something, part of my mental energy or my working memory or my cognitive load is going toward just reading the things on the page, or in this case, just reading the words on the slide. But at the same time, I'm also reflecting on my own thought process. I'm thinking about my thinking or metacognating. What does that mean? At the same time as I'm looking at the slide, right now you're probably thinking, oh, okay, I'm understanding this really well. Or, oh gosh, this is really confusing to me. I better go back and listen to an earlier segment of video. All of that is metacognition. Metacognition is not thinking about the content in front of you. It's a meta level. It's thinking about your thinking about the content. And we metacognate, we're not always aware of it. So whenever you say, oh gosh, I'm really bored right now, or oh gosh, I'm really interested right now, or oh gosh, this is really hard for me, or oh gosh, I don't think I'm doing this in the best way possible because this is taking me a lot of time, you are engaging in metacognition. You are thinking about your own thinking. And so here I'll invite you to pause the video and come up with your own example of what you would consider metacognition to be. And so again, it's in all of the examples that I gave you. It's thinking about your own thought process. So as I'm saying this, for example, I could be thinking to myself, gosh, I'm not articulating this very clearly. I'm thinking about my own thought process. And so the critical question for us is, why do we need metacognition to support critical thinking? And again, I would ask you to pause the video to answer that question. I'll repeat it again. Why do we need metacognition to support critical thinking? And I think that there's a couple of things to think about. So I think that when we talk about critical thinking, we really talk about two components. And the first is critically evaluating information. And I'll say arguments. So that's kind of everything we talked about with skills and with transfer. So it's thinking about what is the quality of the evidence being presented? What is, does the evidence presented support the claim? So all of the critical evaluation that goes hand in hand when we think about evidence. But there's a second part to critical thinking that we should be aware of, which is critically evaluating our own thought process. Let me write that out and think about what that means. So if I am going to be effective in critical thinking, going back to our initial definition of critical thinking, I have to not only think about my own arguments, so not only think about my own evidence supporting my claim, but also think about, well, what might someone else say? What kind of evidence might they present? Thinking about counter arguments, counterclaims, or antithetical arguments. So what might someone else say, and how might they counter argue against me? How might they critique our own thinking? And so that requires us to critically evaluate our own thought process. And what that means is to think about, what assumptions are we making? So if I'm making a particular claim or I'm gathering evidence in a particular way, what am I assuming? Thinking about what is my perspective versus engaging in other perspective taking from another perspective. I say other perspective, let's say perspective taking. And thinking about, am I supporting the argument that I'm making with rich enough evidence, right? So thinking about these kind of counter arguments, or thinking about, is the argument I'm making effective, requires metacognition. It requires us to reflect on our own thinking. And that means that I'm faced not only with evaluating the evidence in front of me, but also thinking about, am I evaluating this evidence in a good way? Am I appropriately dealing with this evidence? Is my thought process a good one? So not only evaluating evidence, but also thinking about our process for evaluating evidence. And so that's why we tend to think of metacognition as fundamental to critical thinking. Because if I'm really being a critical thinker, that I'm not just questioning the evidence in front of me, I'm also questioning my own thought process. So what assumptions am I making? Am I inferring something that I shouldn't? Am I assuming that this evidence supports a claim that it shouldn't? Am I logical in how I'm laying out the evidence supporting my claim? Am I overgeneralizing the claim that I'm making, thinking about inductive reasoning? So as we're thinking about critical thinking, we want to think about supporting students to both evaluate the evidence that's in front of them, that's the critical thinking skills part, but also reflect on their own thought process. And so thinking about these four components of critical thinking instruction, let's think of, associated with each of these, let's think about how we would foster them in the classroom. And so I'm going to create a box that goes hand in hand with each of these four components. And I'm going to ask you to pause the video and think about 3 instructional implications associated with each of these components. And so the first one that we're going to talk about is developing dispositions or particular attitudes that support critical thinking. And so in class, we talked about the kinds of dispositions that students need in order to be able to think critically. And we talk about dispositions at the individual level, but of course, we also think about it as the classroom culture that supports those kinds of dispositions. So if my students are in a particular type of culture, then that's going to help them to develop the kinds of dispositions that support critical thinking. And not to review everything we did in class, but in terms of dispositions, we probably talked about open-mindedness, confidence in expressing their own opinions, a desire for truth, or having an appreciation for the value of getting at some truth, a willingness to disagree, so kind of tolerance for disagreement, and any number of other dispositions. And so let's think about how we can foster those kinds of dispositions in the classroom. And I'll just talk about 3 strategies. There are many, many more, and I would encourage you to come up with some for yourself. But some things that I particularly think are helpful with dispositions. So first, in terms of helping students to disagree effectively, which is not something that students do very readily, right? So there's some students who really like to debate, they really get into it. But for lots of students, it's uncomfortable to say, I disagree with you, or you're wrong. And so a lot of times students don't know how to do that respectfully. I'll add respect to this list. Students don't know how to do that respectfully. So if they disagree with someone, they'll say, well, I think you're wrong, and that's stupid, right? And so we have to teach them how to disagree respectfully. And so one way that I like to do that is to talk about sentence starters. And that's a way of helping students to structure their disagreement. So I teach students that, in this class, we don't use words like, you're stupid. What we say is when we want to disagree with each other, but we want to do that respectfully. And so when you disagree, here's how I would like you to say, I appreciate your comment, but I disagree because. Or giving them another sentence starter that asks them to restate what someone says to them. I see your point that blah, 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 but I think you should consider blah, 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 blah. So giving students templates of conversation for how they could respectfully disagree with one another. A related strategy and something that I discussed is you want to be really explicit about setting norms in your class. So students may not necessarily have been in classes where they are encouraged to disagree with one another, or disagree with you as a teacher, or engage in that kind of critical thinking of information. So if we read something in a textbook, we ask, well, do we think that's true? Do we think that's right? And we question that. And so being really explicit about, in this class, I want you to ask a lot of questions. But here's how we make sure that we are respectful to each other. Another strategy that I love, and people call it different things, but it's to support perspective taking, is wearing many hats. And so what that means is a lot of times it's good for students to be passionate and to care about the thing that they are critically thinking about, right? We need rich materials for students to really be able to analyze things. But sometimes it's helpful for students to adopt the perspective of somebody else. And so we can do that if we're reading a text in history and I give out cards and I say, okay, well, read this text as if you are a Native American, or read this text as if you are someone living back in England and you're thinking about the colonies, or read this text as if you were a colonist. And so asking students to explicitly engage in a perspective that's not their own. And it can even be one that they're uncomfortable with. So if I have a student in my class and it's a government class and they're staunchly Democratic, make them argue for a Republican side. So explicitly asking students to take on others' perspectives. At the same time as going back to other strategies we talked about, we give them sentence starters or norms to help them take on that perspective in respectful ways. So those are just 3 strategies. There are many more, but that should be good to get you started. So the second component of critical thinking instruction that we talked about has to do with critical thinking skills. And those are all of the ones that we've been listing all along in class, but I'll just put some of them here so they are readily available to us. So that's things like deductive and inductive reasoning, verbal reasoning, so being able to articulate your position, decomposing arguments, so knowing what is a claim, what is evidence, and so on. So what are strategies for teaching those kinds of critical thinking skills? Again, I would encourage you to pause the video and come up with some on your own. Here's some things that I'm thinking about. So, first, as we've talked about many times in class, these are absolutely things that you can model for yourself. So, these are absolutely things where if I'm reading a story and I'm the teacher, I can say, oh, well, that doesn't make sense to me. I wonder why this could be. Or if I'm reading something in a newspaper, I can say, oh gosh, I wonder if they have any evidence for this. So I absolutely can model critical thinking. And I can say, I wonder if this generalizes to all other contexts. So part of it is absolutely modeling critical thinking. And that goes hand in hand with developing dispositions because you're explicitly developing norms in the classroom such that if I'm critically thinking, I can expect my students to be critically thinking as well. I also think with critical thinking, you really want to be explicit. So it's really important to teach your students these terms, particularly as they get older. So, for example, you should teach students what deductive reasoning is. You should teach students the word generalizability. So, how does this generalize to other situations? Thinking about your own learning, it was very helpful when you learned the term correlation and causation because that gave you a framework for thinking about, oh, okay, this is one kind of evidence, it's correlational. This is another kind of evidence. It really shows that one thing causes another thing to happen. So just like we talked about with schema, it's very helpful for students to know these kinds of terms. And so it's very helpful for students to be able to say, yeah, I see the claim you're making, but show me the evidence. And we can also think about domain-specific terms. So in science class, they should be talking about hypotheses and what is an experimental design and what is random assignment and what are control variables. And in history class, we should be talking about what are primary sources and secondary sources. And having those terms or having that declarative knowledge supports students to be able to reason about these things. A third strategy that I want to talk about that I think is really effective, and again, kind of resonating through all of these, is being really explicit about teaching those skills. So I am modeling those skills. I am talking about the terms that I should be using when I'm analyzing deductive or inductive reasoning or when I'm analyzing an argument. A third strategy for developing critical thinking skills